Little boy tore the wrapping paper excitedly off of his birthday present. He squealed with joy as he revealed a brand new water gun. As he ran to the sink to fill up his new toy, his mother turned to his grandmother, the one who'd given him the present. "Mom, I can't believe you gave him a water gun. I mean, don't you remember how we used to torment you with those things when we were growing up?" And the grandmother said with a twinkle in her eye, "Oh, yes, I remember." Hi, I'm Alan Rogers. Welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study, where we seek to help you deepen your understanding of the Bible, to help you develop as a disciple of Jesus, and to help you discover your unique place in God's amazing plan. Good to be with you tonight. Now, the story about the grandmother is a cute little story, but in real life, revenge is no laughing matter. We only have to look at recent events in cities like Milwaukee or Atlanta or Portland to see the damage that can result when the cycle of revenge is perpetuated. Jesus addressed revenge in the Sermon on the Mount, and there he called for his followers to do more than simply refrain from revenge. He actually calls on us to be willing to accept the cost of not only withholding revenge, but in making a sacrifice that results in the blessing of others. We're going to take a closer look at Jesus' comments as we examine what I think is one of the most misquoted and misapplied comments Jesus ever made. Jesus began by calling attention to an ancient principle intended to limit retaliation and to ensure just compensation. According to Matthew 5:38, Jesus said, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Now, here Jesus is quoting a principle that is found throughout the law of Moses, what's also known as the Torah, which forms the central core of Judaism. It also served not only as the religious law, but the civic and criminal law for ancient Israel. Now, in that law, we'll find things like, for example, Leviticus 24, verses 19 and 20, that says, "If a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so shall it be inflicted on him." That same principle is referenced in passages like Exodus 21:24 and in Deuteronomy 19:21. This principle, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, actually is older than Moses. It apparently appeared in the Code of Hammurabi, which was composed 300 to 500 years before Moses and nearly 1,800 years before Jesus. This principle still applies quite literally in places in the world today, like Saudi Arabia and Iran. In fact, there was a famous case from Iran back in 2015 about a man who was subjected to surgical blinding. His blinding was punishment for having thrown acid into the face of another man back in 2010, which resulted in the loss of that man's eyesight. An eye for an eye. Now, from our perspective, a lot of people today would say this is just barbaric. However, in the ancient world, this principle actually was an improvement designed to limit the cycle of revenge. Before this limiting principle was adopted, the standard response to an injury was overwhelming retaliation. Maybe you remember the 1987 film, The Untouchables. There's a scene in that movie where Sean Connery's character describes what's called the Chicago way. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. If he sends one of yours to the hospital, then you put one of his into the morgue. Well, that approach is pretty much the way revenge is handled in a lot of places in the world, even today. Here's a question for you. How many of us today live by that same principle? Somebody crosses you and you hit them back twice as hard. Well, getting back to Moses, where we're thinking about a tribal society that was loosely organized with only a rudimentary court system, the principle of an eye for an eye was actually a way to limit retaliation and to keep the cycle of revenge from spinning out of control. Instead of hitting people back twice as hard, punishment had to be commensurate with the crime. By Jesus' day, the rabbis had reinterpreted this principle to allow for monetary compensation instead of physical retaliation. Therefore, this principle has become as much about seeking one's legal rights in court as it was about actual physical revenge. Jesus called on his followers to be even more circumspect in asserting their rights in the face of insult or injury, even more so than the rabbis had done. Matthew 5:39 may be one of the most misquoted and misunderstood statements Jesus ever uttered. That's where he says, "But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other one to him also." Now, first of all, note, Jesus' instruction is not a blanket endorsement of pacifism. A lot of people have interpreted Jesus' words to mean that any resistance to evil is off limits. Some have even interpreted Jesus' words in a way that judges the use of force by the military or even the police to be immoral. Talk about something that connects with our times, huh? I've even heard people use this verse as a pretext for disbanding the military or disarming the police. Now, interpretations like that, while maybe well-meaning, ignore both the context of Jesus' remarks and the audience to whom they were originally addressed. And those are two things whenever you're studying the Bible that you have to keep in mind if you're going to understand a passage correctly. In this case, the context, remember, was the assertion of legal rights. And the audience was Jesus' disciples, those people who made a conscious choice to identify and follow Jesus. Now, we're going to look at why that's important in a moment. First, let's deal with the first part of that, the context. It's important to note that Jesus' instructions are not an invitation to allow oneself to be abused. Jesus is not saying that his followers simply have to sit there and endure abuse. In fact, we have several examples from church history, even from the book of Acts, where Jesus' followers relocated in order to avoid persecution. Most notably, Acts 8:1, where we read, Saul was in hearty agreement with putting Stephen to death, and on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except for the apostles. So in Acts 8, persecution breaks out against the original church, the one in Jerusalem, and most of its members scatter to other locations, except for the leadership, the apostles. Acts also records multiple occasions where the apostle Paul left towns when his life was threatened for preaching the gospel. Therefore, we can take from that it's perfectly acceptable for Jesus' followers to seek to remove themselves from situations where they're facing abuse. Now, given the context of these words, it might be possible to actually argue for a limited physical response for the purpose of self-protection or self-defense. Jesus' instructions to turn the other cheek are a call to voluntarily forego physical and legal retaliation. What Jesus actually was doing was calling on his followers to choose not to assert their legal right for revenge. According to Jesus, it's better to walk away and bear the cost of being wronged than to perpetuate the cycle of retaliation. It's possible to win the fight while losing one's soul in the process. Many times it's better to lose the battle and keep your integrity intact. Here's a real-world illustration for you, something I personally witnessed. A number of years ago, I knew a couple that were having a pretty difficult time in their marriage. The wife abruptly accused the husband of unfaithfulness and filed for divorce. Now, the husband never saw this coming, and he was at a loss how to respond. Some of his well-meaning Christian friends advised him to refuse to acknowledge the divorce papers, not even to consult an attorney, and to put all of his energy into trying to win his wife back. In other words, just to totally put himself defenseless. Other friends encouraged him to hire the toughest, meanest lawyer he could and fight to the end. Here's what he actually did. He took a more moderate approach. After getting over the initial shock, he hired a lawyer to make sure his rights were being protected. He wasn't going to get run over. But he instructed his lawyer not to defend his position too aggressively. Instead, to seek out terms that were actually beneficial to his wife. Now, here's how the story ended. Against all odds, before the divorce was final, this couple reconciled. They broke off the divorce proceedings. They got counseling to help heal their relationship. And as far as I know, last time I saw them, they're still together today. Think about how differently that story might have turned out if the husband had decided to fight aggressively for his rights. Now, ethically, Jesus' instructions can only be expected of those who are willing to accept the cost of following him. Turning the other cheek involves accepting the risk that one's opponent's going to strike the other side as well. Now, a follower of Jesus can choose to accept that risk. After all, we're called to deny ourselves, take up the cross, and follow him. But would it really be ethical to require that risk from another person without their consent? That's why this teaching can't be applied to nations, armies, or police forces. Only to disciples of Jesus. Using this teaching to justify forcing a nation to disarm unilaterally would subject an innocent population to the risk of destruction and suffering without their consent. The only reason that a follower of Jesus can accept this choice is because of our faith in Jesus as the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. We trust that ultimately he's in control. He's the perfect judge. He's going to have the final say. And no matter what happens to us in this life, what we may lose, we know that in the end, he is going to make it right. And because of that faith, we can accept loss now in order to experience his victory later. Jesus called on his followers to actually go beyond what's expected in service to others. In Matthew 5, verses 40 and 41, Jesus elaborated on this self-sacrificial attitude his followers should adopt towards others. He said, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. In these two statements, Jesus pointed to situations where the service due to others was legally limited. In the first case, under Jewish law, a plaintiff could claim a person's tunic as payment for a debt, but not one's outer garment. This was actually a protection for the person who was being sued. Many people use their outer garments as a cover to keep warm at night. So if you confiscated a man's outer garment, that would leave him exposed to the elements. Under Roman law, a civilian could be conscripted to carry a soldier's pack for 1 mile, literally 1,000 paces, but not 1 step more. So if you have a column of Roman soldiers marching by and they're carrying these heavy packs full of equipment, guy's getting a little tired, he can actually pull a civilian off the sidewalk and say, okay, you have to carry my pack for the next mile. But he couldn't require him to carry it any further than that by law. So what Jesus was doing was calling on his followers to voluntarily go above and beyond the legal obligation. Jesus' words go beyond the simple refusal to assert one's rights. Jesus calls on his followers to bear the cost and the effort of being a blessing to other people. Now, think about that. What are some ways that we can go the extra mile in our context? I know of at least one restaurant who's put this into practice. They actually call it second mile service, and they're known all over for the excellent quality of their customer service. But what are some ways you and I could maybe put this attitude into practice? Maybe you can post your thoughts in the comments on that. Going further, Jesus called on his followers to practice generosity towards their neighbors. Jesus wrapped up this section of the Sermon on the Mount by saying, "Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." In other words, people who set out to follow Jesus should practice generosity. We should have generous spirits. You know, it's a great shame that some of Jesus' followers can be the stingiest people around. You don't believe me? Just ask the server at your favorite restaurant how they feel about working the Sunday after lunch shift, or after church lunch shift, rather. Because church people are notoriously lousy tippers. Really, what kind of witness does it make when we stiff the waitress? Think about that next time you go out to eat. Refusing to be generous communicates that we care more about this world's treasures than another person's eternity. On the other hand, practicing generosity demonstrates that we understand we are only stewards and that God has blessed us, not for us to hoard those blessings for ourselves, but so that we can be conduits of blessing for other people. And if you want to see an example of what that looks like, you don't have to go any further than Jesus. Jesus sets the ultimate example of selfless sacrifice. The classic description of that is in Philippians chapter 2. from verses 5 through 8. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Paul describes there how the Son of God, who had all the rights and privileges that go with being part of the Godhead, voluntarily, out of love for you and me, set those things aside temporarily in order to be incarnated into a human body with all the limitations that that entails, and to live a life of perfect obedience to God the Father on our behalf. And he did that because he loved you, and he wanted you to be reconciled with God. And we're called to imitate that example. In Ephesians 5, verses 1 and 2, we're told, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Where would we be if Jesus had asserted his rights and privileges as the eternal Son of God? Aren't you glad he didn't? It said that Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, once captured a prince and his family. When they were brought before Cyrus, the monarch asked the prisoner, "What will you give me if I release you?" And the prince said, "The half of my wealth. And if I release your children, then, sire, everything I possess. And if I release your wife, your majesty, I will give you myself." Well, the story goes that Cyrus was so moved by this man's devotion that he not only freed his family, but he freed him as well. And as they returned home, the prince said to his wife, "Wasn't Cyrus a handsome man?" And the wife, with a deep look of love in her eye, said to her husband, "I didn't notice. I could only keep my eyes on you, the one who was willing to give himself for me." Well, Jesus gave himself for our sake. How should we respond to that example of sacrifice? If you want to know more about following Jesus, please reach out to me at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. If you enjoyed this video, if you found this information helpful, please help us spread the word about it by giving it a like and sharing it with your friends. Until next time, keep walking on the narrow road in Jesus' footsteps.